Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you as always. I will just say for the support. Lots of people been emailing me. I know some of you have kind of said that you really appreciate having analysis that's clearly not trying to promote one side or another, but trying to cut through all sorts of disinformation. And that is what I'm trying to do. So if you appreciate the work, you can also support me on Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. So appreciated. Okay, lots to talk about today. Let's jump right into it. Really great piece that was sent to me by a supporter on Patreon. This was from Task and Purpose. Really interesting piece because it actually gets into something that I've touched on in previous videos, namely the military situation and how we should read whether or not Russia is bogged down, whether or not Russia has a failed strategy, whether this is already a disaster and a quagmire, or if maybe we're being a little bit too quick to make a determination. So, I've talked a little bit about how the Russian military operation seems to have stalled. That if you follow the corporate press in the West, in the United States especially, that seems to be the sort of consensus, whether you're talking to the military experts like Petraeus or, General Petraeus or, the various talking heads and so forth. I mean, they all talk about Russia as essentially, stuck in the mud, spinning its wheels, sort of directionless and indiscriminately bombing, cities and what have you. And while they are certainly indiscriminately bombing in some situations, it does seem that reporting from the ground seems to indicate that Russia is changing some of its tactics, and they are having some limited success with those new tactics. So let's talk a little bit about them. So this piece really gets into some of the sort of nitty gritty of military tactics and strategy. And I think it's worthwhile to think about because, again, although I'm not a military person myself, I'm certainly reading what military experts, especially those who are either on the ground in Ukraine, as the author of this article is, advising some of these special forces, or experts who are sort of analyzing it from the outside. So anyway, a shift in tactics. That's the most important thing that seems to be noticed from the Russians. Initially, what you saw from the Russians was that they were basically leading with armored columns, tanks, and these type of vehicles, these type of forces were sent in first as kind of an attempt to sort of break through quickly, right? This is what we saw stalled in the first days, famously Ukrainian farmers using their tractors to drag away tanks or, other vehicles and so forth, right? This was kind of shared all over the internet, memes. All of these things kind of were part of the kind of, I don't want to say celebratory considering it was a war, but sort of the enthusiastic mood of those who were watching Ukraine sort of valiantly defending itself. But we don't see so many of those videos anymore, do we? We don't see a lot of Russian vehicles being taken away by, Ukrainian farmers. Instead, what we now see is that the Russians are no longer leading with armored battalions. They are now leading with electronic warfare. They're leading with drones, with laser weapons. They're using cruise missiles. They're doing all sorts of military actions that don't involve sending in infantry, that don't involve sending in these mechanized battalions. And so this is changing the nature of Russia's military assaults, these campaigns. Of course, we know that they are bombing in places like Mariupol. We know all about the battle for Mariupol, but Mariupol's only one city. The Russians are, in fact, engaging in quite a number of attacks all over the country. And so this is kind of how they're doing it. The targets now are shifting. It wasn't, at least originally, we saw that the Russians were avoiding striking anything really in Western Ukraine. It seems now quite the opposite. They are directly targeting elements in Western Ukraine, specifically with regard to logistics, supply chains, supply routes, manufacturing centers, and especially training bases. We saw some of those missile strikes carried out by the Russians from sea that struck at least, I think, one or two of those military bases in Western Ukraine. So this again tells us that the Russians have sort of adjusted to some extent, recalibrated how they think about how to go about attacking Ukraine's military. Now, one of the interesting observations in this piece that, and again, sort of illustrates the importance of reading from military experts as well as, sort of political and economic experts, is the fact that the nature of the air operations is changing. And specifically, it looks like the Russians are now almost exclusively conducting air operations at night. And the speculation, probably correct, is that this is directly because the Russians now know Ukrainian Stingers and other anti-aircraft systems simply don't have thermal sights. They can't operate effectively at night. The Russians understand this, and now the Russians seem to be using the cover of night to carry out a lot of these strikes. These are cruise missile strikes, but others as well. Artillery. This is critical for the Russians. If you want to look at where the strengths and the weaknesses are from a military perspective, it's pretty clear, actually. Anybody following enough Telegram channels can tell you it seems pretty clear. The Russian weakness is with their infantry, and the Russian strength is with their artillery. This is what the military experts seem to all kind of have come to a consensus on, and it makes sense that we are now seeing the Russian military strategy shifting to a much more artillery-centric kind of strategy. Now, the ultimate point of the article here, and I just kind of thought that this was really the primary thing we should be thinking about, is that while Ukrainian resistance is undoubtedly heroic and courageous and all of those things, the Ukrainian command, the leadership understands that time is simply not on their side. I think the quote in the article was that the Russians have the long clock. In other words, the Russians have more supplies, they have more soldiers, more weapons, they have better, communications equipment, they are better, equipped and so forth, right? So the point being, the Russians can carry on this way for days, weeks, months, if need be, and the Ukrainians simply can't. And so it's not simply a matter of a war of attrition, it's also a matter of the Russians now realizing the nature of the resistance in Ukraine and shifting what they're doing. I think this is worth paying attention to, thanks to my Patreon supporter who sent me that excellent article. Okay, let me move on. As always, there is just so much to cover. I want to talk a little bit about the Russian tech sector. How in the hell is Russia supposed to survive as a technologically advanced economy, a technologically developed economy, if they can't get their hands on semiconductors? Now, let's just illustrate what I'm talking about. Really, we already knew that, Intel and AMD, et cetera, these companies, that they were not going to continue to do business in Russia. But where Russia is now facing a real crisis is the fact that, the primary, one of the main suppliers for the entire world is TSMC. That is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And TSMC has said they are done manufacturing for the Russians. Now, this is a lot of things, but the first thing that we have to note is that this is an example of just how powerful U.S. sanctions really are. U.S. sanctions are the primary reason that that this Taiwanese manufacturing company is no longer going to be exporting to Russia. And what I mean is that TSMC, according to internal documents and reporting, TSMC is fearful of the U.S. Export Control Reform Act, the ECRA. And the ECRA is a really interesting piece of legislation that I think tells you quite a lot about how the United States is able to use intellectual property and copyright and things like that to sort of extend its imperial hegemony. Anyway, the ECRA, the Export Control Reform Act, stipulates that any goods, even those that are produced outside of the United States, but that are produced with U.S. technologies and with U.S. components, that all of those are falling under the purview of the sanctions. They are within the jurisdiction, I guess you could say, of the sanctions. So even though Taiwan has not placed sanctions on Russia, the fact that they produce these semiconductors using U.S. technology, like from and selling to companies like Apple and Qualcomm and all of these other companies, right? That fact alone makes it very difficult to see how TSMC could continue to do business with the Russians. They're obviously choosing to err on the side of caution. And why wouldn't they? Russia is irrelevant to them in the grand scheme of the global supply. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Actually, and when I say in a second, I mean exactly right now. Russian industry is going to be hit really hard by this, but TSMC is not. Right? Russia makes up almost nothing. They make up 0.1% of the microchip market. So it is a very negligible loss for the microchip manufacturers. So Russia is not going to be able, as we know, they're not going to be able to access Intel, AMD, or TSMC. Okay, so that means that they really have only one source for microchips, and that's going to be in China. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is in a second. It is the Chinese Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, but we'll get to that. Anyway, so how big is TSMC and what does it really mean here? TSMC is one of the most important companies in the world. They are valued at $550 billion in the market, half of the semiconductor market globally. Apple, Intel, Qualcomm, AMD, Nvidia, all of the biggest companies in the world are purchasing chips manufactured by TSMC. So for them to cut off Russia is a huge development. Russian sanctions were supposed to lead to domestic production in Russia. The sanctions that were placed in 2013 and 2014 that the Russian government attempted to use to kind of kickstart a domestic microchip manufacturing sector, that has more or less produced almost nothing. So then the question really becomes, can China replace what Russia is losing here? Well, the short answer to that is no. The longer answer to that is no for a number of reasons, including the sheer complexity of production. We're not talking about, making shoes here. We're talking about semiconductors, microchips, some of the more advanced hardware that is required in the global tech market, right? So, according to experts, it would take years, if not several decades, for Russia to set up a true self-sustaining domestic production system for microprocessors. So multi-stage production to build these things, up to 1,500 steps in the production process. Like I said, it is an extremely complex production system. China has also been working to reduce their reliance on TSMC and on Western companies in order to be able to sort of compete with the United States. But even that is not really working out in that way. They have also kind of signaled a serious worry that China could get, and I talked about this in a prior video, that China itself could get caught up in these secondary sanctions. It's part of the reason why the Bank of China and the Bank of Industry and Commerce in China is also not willing to help the Russians evade sanctions, because they're afraid of getting caught themselves in secondary sanctions. Now, who's going to get hit hard? What sectors of the economy are going to get hit the hardest? Well, the first and most obvious is the Russian defense industry, Russian military hardware. All of that is running on these microchips. How are they going to be able to service already existing equipment, let alone developing new military hardware? This is also going to seriously impact the Russian space agency, Roscosmos. This will have a major impact on civil aviation, on supercomputers, on the tech sector, on just basic business, the functioning of business. It's going to impact everything. Okay, absolutely everything. So again, the Chinese are really the only other option for the Russians, and the Chinese Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, or SMIC, they're there, but they are not producing at the advanced level that their Taiwanese counterparts or the U.S. Is producing. In fact, they're not able to produce anything close to what currently you can get from TSMC. So, what does this mean? It basically means that the Russians are going to be forced into a relationship with the Chinese where they're going to be buying subpar microprocessors to hopefully keep everything running for them. All right, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to talk very quickly about another impact. Well, actually, no, I'm going to hold off. I have more to say about impact of sanctions on other sectors of the Russian economy, but you can go over to the Patreon for that. Let me finish up talking a little bit about the resignation of Anatoly Chubais. This made some headlines in the West. You know sort of the idea that there are these high profile defections from the Putin government. And Chubais is high profile because not because his current position is all that meaningful. He was in an environmental post, an envoy for climate change, for a president in a petro, you know, economy in a country that doesn't really care all that much about climate change. So it didn't really matter his resignation to the functioning of the government, but it is symbolic because Chubais is a liberal. Chubais is one of the few liberals who remained in Putin's government. Chubais was also the finance minister in the 1990s and is known as, for better or worse, the man who presided over the creation of the class of parasites that we now call the oligarchs. And without getting into the sort of nuances of that whole history, the point is that there were very shady loans for, I don't want to say loans, but these kind of share buying, stock buying schemes that allowed a very small number of people to basically privatize and enrich themselves off of the assets of the Soviet state. This is the system that created the oligarchs, and Chubais is, for better or worse, the one who presided over that as finance minister. Now, there has been a lot written about all of that, and Chubais himself, as well as executives from BP and others who were there at the time, talk about how there wasn't exactly a huge option, that you were basically choosing between a sort of bandit post-communism and a bandit capitalism, and the asset strippers from the West came and did what they did. And indeed, that is true. Chubais, he has a complicated and sort of checkered legacy. But either way, the fact that he was still in the government today and is resigned and is now presumably in Turkey or somewhere else outside of Russia, this is a pretty big deal. The question, of course, the obvious question is, will there be more higher profile resignations, and by whom? One interesting one was the rumor that Elvira Nabiullina, who is the head of the Russian central bank, that she was planning on resigning, but something may have convinced her otherwise, and she's actually been reaffirmed or reappointed in her role. Is she possibly considering fleeing the country? Is she possibly considering taking a stand against Putin? It's unclear, but there is some speculation about that. Two more interesting figures to keep an eye on would be Alexei Kudrin, also former finance minister, also seen as something of a liberal-minded, reform-minded, neoliberal type. He has a fairly prominent role as I think the head of the auditing agency in the Russian government today. But anyway, he is seen as somebody also of the sort of older guard in the post-Soviet Russian government. And I've made a point in talking several times about how one of my suspicions is that part of what's driven Putin to take what I consider to be extremely irrational decisions is that he simply doesn't have in his ear some of the more moderate voices that used to be there. Kudrin is an example of those kind of voices. He's not the only one, but he's one. And also Hermann Greff, who is the head of Sberbank, the one of the most important banks in Russia, one whose stock has taken a beating, a very serious beating since the war began. All three of these, Nabiullina, Greff, and Kudrin, are all candidates for fleeing the country. All of them are clearly going to stand to lose a great deal from everything that's happening here. Now, what do we make of the resignations? Do they indicate the crack up of the Putin government? I would say probably not. I would say that what it does indicate, though, is that the sort of liberal intelligentsia kind of political class, the educated elite class that is not in power, that they are now no longer simply going to sit as a sort of opposition, a Western facing opposition, but they're quite literally going to flee. And that dovetails with what Putin and others have been saying since the speech earlier, I guess it was a week ago or so, about a cleansing of society, that really fascistic statement from Putin, a necessary cleansing of society. Well, don't make any mistake about it. Yes, of course, they could be talking about actual killing, but really, I think what they're really talking about is a cleansing of society, because it's going to be a sort of self-selective process whereby those who are anti-Putin, who are liberal European facing, are simply going to leave the country, and those who remain would be the true Russians, as it were. This is obviously extremely fascistic, but it does sort of fit neatly and quite nicely into Putin's vision of the new Russia. Anyway, I'm over 20 minutes now. I'm going to have to leave it there. There's so much to discuss. Go over to the Patreon. Did you know that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was missing for 11 days? Didn't make one public appearance? That's odd, don't you think? I'm also going to talk about the impact of sanctions on Russian shipbuilding and on aviation. Those are both really critical areas. And I also am going to talk a bit about the global diesel shortage, a shortage of diesel fuel. That is an absolute nightmare. And BP leaving the country. A lot more to discuss, so much more. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.